Israel and the Palestinian armed group Islamic Jihad have declared a truce, raising hopes of an end to the 3 days of Israeli bombardment in Gaza that has killed at least 44 Palestinians, including 15 children. The truce began at 11:30 p.m. local time on Sunday, despite a flurry of Israeli air raids and Palestinian rocket attacks up until the last minute. There is more to look at in the timeline of the conflict.
While both sides agreed to halt the fighting, each has warned the other that it would respond with force to any violence. On Friday, Israel launched its heavy bombardment of Gaza, flattening buildings and striking refugee camps across the territory. The Israeli military said it has been targeting members of the Islamic Jihad, including the group's senior commanders, but according to Palestinian officials, almost half of the 44 people who died have been civilians. At least 350 Palestinian civilians have also been wounded. Islamic Jihad responded by firing hundreds of rockets into Israel, but most were intercepted or blown up. Israeli emergency services said 3 people in Israel were wounded by shrapnel, while 31 others were lightly hurt. The fighting was the worst in Gaza since an 11-day war last year that killed at least 250 people in the impoverished coastal enclave and about 13 people in Israel. Sunday's truce was mediated by Egypt with help from the United Nations and Qatar. The Secretary General of Islamic Jihad, Saad al-Nakali, said one of the key agreements was an Egyptian guarantee that it would work towards the release of 2 of the group's leaders who are being held by Israel. Egypt issued a statement saying it is exerting efforts to release the leaders as soon as possible. There was no immediate comment from Israel. Mr. al-Sadi's arrest last week in the occupied West Bank was one of the key triggers of the latest escalation. Israeli forces also arrested 19 more members of the Islamic Jihad in the occupied West Bank. In Gaza, news of the truce brought dozens of people to the streets in celebration. The United States and the UN also welcomed the truce. U.S. President Joe Biden thanked his Egyptian counterpart, Abdel Fattah el-Sisi, for his country's role in brokering the ceasefire and called for investigations into civilian casualties, which he called a tragedy. Despite the halt to the fighting, Palestinians in Gaza said they cannot live normal lives because of Israel's 15-year siege.
Right, Temitope Lodo is a security analyst and he joins me on World Now from London to discuss this. Thank you so much for joining us on World Now.
Thank you very so much for having me.
Absolutely. Palestinian Islamic Jihad has said there would be no ceasefire if members are not freed. Isn't this raising the specter of more violence?
There's no doubt that this is a fragile kind of ceasefire because we know that 2 of their top-ranking, at least what you call commanders, is still with the Israeli, with another 19 that have been held by the Israeli. And it is important to understand the shift in the Israeli policy. The initial policy is normally to defend themselves after rockets have landed within the Israeli territory. But for the first time, this is a preemptive strike, which has resulted in the death, according to observers, of 44 Palestinians and 15 of them being children. And I think, of course, it's important to say that this is even much not as worse as the war that happened last year in May. But the issue is this reoccurrence of violence. And many observers have been looking at this and asking the question, where will enough be enough? When are we going to have a solution to this issue and more or less find peace for the Palestinians and the Israelis who are actually on the fire from these 2 groups that are always at loggerheads?
But come to think of it, the civilians are the ones bearing the brunt of the fight between Israel and Palestine. There have been more than 500 rockets fired in Israel, sirens heard in Tel Aviv. To what extent do you think Israel is actually looking for a way out?
There are 2 schools of thought. The bottom line is that many countries have a right, to defend themselves, and that's what we've been calling on every country, including the Nigerian nation where you are, to defend their people that are being picked, by bandits and, blow them out of the through the air or whichever means. But Israel is doing what they have to do, to protect their citizens, and Israeli citizens know that Israel will protect them. Over 1,100, missiles were, launched into Israel, and 97% of them was intercepted. You don't pick a fight with Israeli, and not, feel the consequence of that because you're fighting against a state that protects their citizens. So of course, Israel needs to be a bit more cautious, because of world opinion on the issue. But Israel will tell you that they are defending themselves, and preemptive strike is allowed, under international law. Others might have a different view, but we've seen clearly that Americans are already supporting the Israeli as well as the British government. And this is where the problem lies. When you have countries that are willing to support them, and Israeli will do whatever to protect themselves. We've known that since 1967, when this incident have been reoccurring, Israelis will always protect themselves. But we must find a way to find a solution. And many have said that the Israeli government might not actually be interested in solution. And even some analysts have said that maybe it's because of the upcoming election that the Israeli president have decided to, our prime minister have decided to do what he had done. Only God knows. But what we know is that this needs to stop. The Israelis need to be able to live in peace without being afraid of rockets coming from the other side. And the Gaza people also need to know that their homes will not be destroyed and their children dying needlessly because of some militants doing what they need to do.
Right. Right. When we are tired of something and when we don't know what to say, that's when we tend to, leave it in the hand of God. But what we have seen in recent years are short-term agreements that will not address the root cause of the problem because the mediation has focused on conflict management and not conflict resolution. So from your own perspective, very quickly, would these processes produce effective results?
There's no doubt that it's meant to produce, but I don't see how it will produce. We need to understand that Gaza is more like a prison, and people are stuck there since 2005. We're talking of a lot of years now that they've been blocked both on air, sea, and land, and people feel as if they're caged. But we need to also understand it from the Israeli perspective, who believe that once they allow, a free flow of things from each other, these militants, the ones that are not the majority, but those few people are coming in with weapons that they want to shoot into Israel. And that is where the problem is. And the issue is a two-state solution, as many have advocated. I think that will help. I think there is need for the Israeli to allow these people to be able to, rule themselves. And they will say, of course, we're allowing them to rule themselves, but they prefer to allow the militant to be their chief executive instead of ordinary people that will be looking forward to a solution, a proper solution, where there will be peace in Israel and peace in Palestine.
Fantastic.
As far as I'm concerned, I think there is a serious issue here.
Absolutely.
All the world need to get involved and see.
I think that's a very convenient place for us to leave it and see how peace is actually finally returned, to the Palestinians and the breach between them and Israel. Security analyst Temitope Olodo, thank you so much for your insight.
Thank you so much for having me.